Okay. So, Assalamu alaikum and welcome all to Strive's event on United Against Racism. And before we start our proceedings, we'll start off with the recitation of the Holy Quran by Master Ibrahim. So, Ibrahim, do start with the recitation.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم إن الله عليم خبير. Human beings, we created you all from a male and a female, and made you into nations and tribes so that you may know one another. Verily, the noblest of you in the sight of Allah is the most God-fearing of you. Surely Allah is the all-knowing, the all-aware.
Okay, thank you. Jazakallah khair, Ibrahim. So again, we welcome you all to this event on United Against Racism. So I'm not going to give much of an intro. We all are aware of what's happening right now with the Black Lives Matter imploding again. And the question of racism and how we deal with it is again at the forefront. And again, the issue is how we deal with it. And dealing with it includes an idea of identifying what racism is and to understand how it operates. And with us today, we have 3 speakers, and all 3 of them come from both an academic expertise and from an activist trajectory. And all 3 of them are prominent in their respective fields. And we have Dr. Fatima Rajina, Dr. Ismail Patel, and Sheikh Danjuma Bihari. So what I would like to do is that Dr. Fatima will speak first, inshallah. The mode is that each speaker will speak for 15 minutes, and I will introduce each speaker before they speak rather than all 3 in the beginning. And after they speak, we'll go over to discussions and the Q&A, inshallah. So our first speaker is Dr. Fatima Rajina. Dr. Fatima Rajina was previously at Goldsmiths, and her area of expertise is to do with the Asian community, specifically the Bangladeshi community here. That's her focus of her research. She's spoken before and written on racism in the UK, how it's institutionalized, and especially among the Asian community as well. So we will start off with Dr. Fatima Rajina. So Dr. Fatima, please, could you?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the intro, and salam alaikum to everyone tuning in, joining. I want to thank StriveUK and Shaheen for reaching out and for inviting me to speak today. So I know I've only got 15 minutes, so I'm going to get going. I think for the 15 minutes, what I wish to do is to sort of give those who are joining this conversation an overview of institutional racism in the UK. And for the purposes of the 15 minutes that I have, I've only chosen 2 specific events in British history to illustrate sort of the nature of institutional racism, what it is, and how it played out. So the first discussion that I want to have, or the first case study I want us to consider, is the Brixton uprisings, which happened in 1981 over a period of 2 days in April. Now, before we come to April in 1981, I want us to consider what was happening at the beginning of the year in 1981. And there was a new crossfire in January where 13 young Black people died. And till today, there hasn't been anyone held accountable for this. And then following a few months later, there was Operation Swamp 81 in South London, in Brixton in particular, where there is a big, particularly Caribbean community there. And a lot of plainclothed officers, so Operation Swamp 81 was basically an operation led by plainclothed officers who were given the right to stop and search, mostly, in fact, just young Black men under the sus law, which is basically anyone who is a suspected person or acting suspiciously. So anything could be suspicious to the police, and they can stop and search you. Towards the end of my talk, I will give you some of the most updated statistics on stop and search and the sort of ethnic and racial sort of breakdown. So this sort of uprising happened in 81 for 2 days. And following this, there was a famous report that came out by the end of 1981, which was known as the Scarman Report. And in this report, there were a lot of discussions around various issues, social inequalities, economic inequalities. But what the report didn't do was condemn police racism, and it in fact denied the existence of institutional racism. So this was in 1981. And the second case study I want us to consider for today is the murder of Stephen Lawrence. So Stephen Lawrence himself was an architecture student, and he was out with his friend Dwayne Brooks, and in the evening of 22nd of April 1993, Stephen Lawrence was killed while they were waiting at a bus stop in southeast London. And this happened on the 22nd of April in 1993. So what I'm going to do is give you sort of an outline of the different dates throughout the years and what happened and how this case developed and why it's crucial for today's discussion on institutional racism. So 6th of May was when, 22nd of April 1993 is when he is murdered by a group of white men, white young boys in southeast London. Following that, 6th of May, so there was a meeting with Nelson Mandela. So the family of Stephen Lawrence had a meeting with Nelson Mandela, who was here from South Africa. And it was a day after this particular meeting with Mandela that arrests were made of those who were accused of murdering Stephen Lawrence. Now, what happened following all of this is many, many years later, about 6 years after, there was an inquiry led into to look at and consider the death of Stephen Lawrence and why there was such discrepancy between why the police were taking so long, why they weren't responding when people were giving names of the people who potentially killed Stephen Lawrence. So this public inquiry was launched in 1997. So 4 years later, so it was 99 the report came out, but 1997 the public inquiry was launched, and it was chaired by Sir William Macpherson, hence the name of the report, Macpherson Report. And it was in 1998 of July that the Met Police Commissioner officially apologized to the family. And February of 1999, the Macpherson Report came out, and the report accused the police of institutional racism, and they made up to 70 recommendations in this. And then 2008 of February, his mum opened up his memorial, which got attacked and suspected as a racist attack. January 2012, 2 of the people were convicted and given life sentences for Lawrence's murder. 2013 of June, a former police officer named Peter Francis was known for spying on the family, and the police were initially denying this, that this police officer had tried to infiltrate the family and spy on them. March 2016, a former ex-Metropolitan Police commander tried to get information on the family. And then 2018, so 2 years ago, marked 25 years since his death. Now, those of you who are not perhaps familiar with the British context, I mean, this case is still ongoing. The other young men who are now grown adult men have still not been caught. This case is likely still pending. But I think what I want to emphasize here is the Scarman Report of 81 did not acknowledge the role of institutional racism within the police, and in fact it denied the existence of institutional racism. So this was quite an achievement, that in 1999, when this report came out, the Macpherson Report, to declare the police to be institutionally racist is you could say a moment in history that's defined. It's one of those historical moments that you can't that you would have to reference in order to speak about institutional racism and just racism in general about Britain and what it meant and what Stephen Lawrence's mum Doreen Lawrence had to go through to hold the state to account for its negligence of this case. Now, I want to read out two passages from this report, just so you get an idea of how institutional racism was being discussed in the report by various people. So one of them is the following, and it's in the Macpherson report on section 6.28. And in this, the term institutional racism is discussed in this and framed in this particular way. And they say, the term institutional racism should be understood to refer to the way the institution or the organization may systematically or repeatedly treat or tend to treat people differentially because of their race. So in effect, we're not talking about the individuals within the service who may be unconscious as to the nature of what they're doing, but it is the net effect of what they do. Now, this continues, and this quote continues, and they say, a second source of institutional racism is our culture within the police service. Much has been said about our culture, the canteen culture, the occupational culture. How and why does that impact on individuals, Black individuals on the street? Well, we would say the occupational culture within the police service, given the fact that the majority of police officers are white, tends to be the white experience, the white beliefs, the white values. And it continues and says, given the fact that these predominantly white officers only meet members of the Black community in confrontational situations, they tend to stereotype Black people in general. This can lead to all sorts of negative views and assumptions about Black people, so we should not underestimate the occupational culture within the police service as being a primary source of institutional racism in the way that we differentially treat Black people. Interestingly, I say we because there is no marked difference between Black and white in the force essentially. We are all consumed by this occupational culture. Some of us may think we rise above it on some occasions, but generally speaking, we tend to conform to the norms of this occupational culture, which we say is all powerful in shaping our views and perceptions of a particular community. Now, this is quite important to consider, particularly the third section that I just read, where the officer said that it's actually irrelevant whether you're Black or white or Asian within the police force, because this is intrinsically a part of its culture, its way of dealing with communities, particularly the Black community. And also the way Black community is framed, particularly following the Brixton uprisings, which I refuse to call riots, because riots has a particular connotation where it implies that the violence is just coming out of nowhere, that this people taking to the streets, using the street as the space to demand change. As if people are coming to riot just for the sake of it, but as if there's no purpose. And I think it's important to remember that the uprisings themselves, particularly the various uprisings that have happened in Britain from 1919, the port riots, 1981 in Brixton, 2011, 56. So I think if we consider these various sort of uprisings in Britain, they have almost always been a response to violence perpetrated by the oppressor. And in this case, this is the police I'm referencing. And of course, I'm happy in the Q&A to go further into sort of the details of the pacification of communities and how they're co-opted and how they're silenced. And just one last point I want to make about violence is that so Frantz Fanon, the Martinican psychiatrist, he explains how violence itself derives from the racialized views that the colonizer has about the colonized subjects. And again, within the Q&A, I'm more than happy to go into and elaborate on what these particular perceptions involve, and looking at the history, and perhaps it will likely be complemented by the other speakers. But before I end, there's just one other thing that I want to share with you. So whilst researching for this lecture, I wanted to get some of the latest stop and search statistics, and this is what I found. And this is on official government website, these stop and search statistics, and it was last updated in March of this year. And so the statistics they put on their site was between April 2018 and March 2019. And what they found was in England and Wales, they found there were 4 stop and searches for every 1,000 white people, compared with 38 for every 1,000 Black people, and 11 times more likely for Asian people. Now in London, this is much higher than the statistics for England and Wales. So for London, what they found is the stop and search by Metropolitan Police officers is 51 stop and searches for every 1,000 Black people in London. And across England and Wales, the conclusion of this particular short report was that Black people had the highest stop and search rates in every police force across England and Wales. So it was, I mean, although yes, the number is very high for London, but I think it's really crucial that, remember, according to the government statistics itself, that Black people had the highest stop and search rates in every police force in the country, and including Wales. So I think what I would like the listeners today and those who have joined this conversation is to consider how racial profiling is still very much a prominent feature of the British police state and the police that is there to manage the streets, that is put out there by the state to pacify and to essentially there to protect the ruling class. So, you know, I think we've got to consider why and where the police, why they're there, who they're there to protect, and how much they very much still participate in entrenching racialized violence on particular bodies because they deem it to be acceptable, and that's the way to manage social order in Britain. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Fatima. I know it was a challenge to contain all what you have to say in 15 minutes. It's quite a challenge. So our next speaker is Dr. Ismail Patel. Dr. Ismail Patel is based at Leicester, and he's the founder of the Friends of Al-Aqsa. And he's quite a prominent fixture in the British Muslim political scene. And he has both a background as an academic and as an ardent activist. And I'm sure he'll also have a lot to say on Islamophobia. Islamophobia being a topic of his research, and his focus is spoken on that before as well. And he writes regularly on such issues in The Guardian and Al Jazeera and other media outlets. So Dr. Ismail, please, you can start off your talk here. Sure.
Assalamu alaikum, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you to Dr. Fatima for a very good first part. What I want to do is just give a taster, really, on how we can understand or frame Islamophobia. And the second part I want to touch on is how it impacts intra-Muslim communities' relationship, how we ourselves as Muslims come to behave under the shadow of Islamophobia. I just want to add some statistics to what Dr. Fatima already mentioned, and it's important to help us frame Islamophobia. We've had the statistics for stop and search. Just to give you some more statistics, and this again are from government websites or official documented data. So they state that 19% of full-time employment in Britain, Muslims rather occupy 19% of full-time employment as compared to 35% of white population. On the other side, 6% of Muslims occupy managerial positions as compared to 10% of the white population. And 24% of Muslims are on long-term unemployment or have never worked, 24%, as compared to 6%. And 46% of Muslims live in the 10% poorest region in the country. Now, these are very important statistics. I'll give you two others, and I'll tell you why I'm giving you this. On Schedule 7, which gives authority to the police at ports, at airports, at ferry ports to stop individuals and search them. Under Schedule 7, 80% of all stops carried out have been on Muslims. These are from 2017, 2018. And the Lamy report, the David Lamy report, the MP, also found that 15% of the prison population is made up of Muslims when we constitute 5% of the population. On top of that, if we look a survey that was conducted last year on the British public, 44% think that Muslims are not conducive to Western civilization, and 31% think that we're a danger to the British way of life. The reason I'm giving you these statistics is I've missed out something very important here. Is when we frame Islamophobia, we tend to think of it as physical action. We tend to think of it as attacks, physical attack on our persons, either sisters, hijab being pulled, being spat at, being struck violently, or massages or building being attacked. What this shows is that the data that I've provided you with, that Islamophobia is not simply a physical action. If we reduce Islamophobia towards its physical aspect only, we will not be able to address or counter it. And therefore, we have to understand and try and frame Islamophobia in a wider perspective. We have to try to understand how, as Dr. Fatima mentioned about a culture, and a society emerges in which it tries to differentiate one group of people and considers them a target, and a target that is justifiable. That's the two things that are very, very important. One, it becomes a target, but that target is such that most people justify it. That, this is something they have to do to protect themselves. This sort of moves Islamophobia from a real and tangible aspect to more of a discourse in how a society comes to create a hegemonic idea about the other. Now, as I said right at the beginning, I'm only giving you a taster, so I'm not going to go into the whole theory and idea of creating the other. But what our most important aspect that we as Muslim community, which most of the listeners are today, is to understand that Islamophobia is not only a physical aspect. Islamophobia goes much more deeper. And if we only reserve in understanding Islamophobia to the physical aspects, we'll find it very, very difficult to counter it in the long run. And this is one of the problems that the definition of Islamophobia has come up with. When the APPG proposed the definition of Islamophobia as a type of racism that attacks expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness, politicians were reluctant to accept that. Although Liberal Democrats, the Labour Party, some councillors have accepted it, but the government will not accept it, because it is the idea of politicizing a Muslim identity that has been racialized and that is becoming problematic. That idea is something we have to take forward. Now, no definition on its own is going to solve our problem, but what it does do is that it frames the whole idea of creating the other and the Muslim, problematizing a Muslim, into a bigger, wider picture and brings into the whole discourse of how Muslims are being problematized. So this is something very important. And as I say, this is just absolutely an introduction to the whole idea and concepts. So the first message is Islamophobia is not simply a physical attack on Muslims. It goes much more deeper. It's a whole way of thinking that has an impact on Muslims on every strata of their life, from education, housing, work, their interrelationship, the promotion that works, how they travel around. All these things are impacted on Muslims. And that is in a bigger, wider network of Islamophobia that we should be focused upon and try and address. The second part is that this is going to be a very short talk. I'm not going to take 15 minutes. The second part is what's the impact of this on intra-Muslim relationship? Because I think one thing Islamophobia does that we tend to also forget is that it isolates the community, rather racism in generally, but Islamophobia, it isolates Muslims community itself. Because then what happens is each sector within the community tries to address that in a different way. And I think there's about 5 different ways. You could expand it, but there's 5 different main ways in which Muslims have reacted. So first is isolationism. Muslims think that we live in a country where everybody hates us, so we have to isolate, create little bubbles, and try and operate in that bubble and only interact wherever is necessary with the wider community. Opposite to that is the assimilation approach, where they think, maybe there is something wrong with Muslims. We live as a minority in a majority non-Muslim country, and therefore we have to adopt everything they tell us to. So they become assimilatist and they try to integrate within the society. The third aspect is respectability, where Muslims try to gain respect not by standing up for what they believe in, but by standing up to the values that are shown to be what is civilized. And this is very important differentiation here of respectability. One form of respectability is where you demand to be accepted for what you are. So you stand up and you profess yourself as your beliefs, your ideas, your identity, which are then put across to the society in which they have to accept you for what you are. The other aspect of respectability is that you succumb to what is considered as respectable. So the norms of whatever the nation we're living under, or the idea of civilization itself, we try to conform to that. And that has many repercussions. Hopefully we'll come to that later on. The fourth aspect is retaliation. There are some, obviously, who feel that they feel aggrieved, they don't know what to do, and they retaliate. They try to address that through physical means because they haven't got any other means. Either they have suffered so much, they've not had justice, injustices have been visited upon them, and they come to retaliate against this. Now, this is the fourth group. And the fifth person is to acquiesce towards the management. And I would say most of us would fit into this category, where we accept the management of, or the governance of how we should be governed as a minority in a majority state. So that again brings about our conduct and how we behave. Or we accept certain norms. We do not question things. So talk about institutional racism. For example, 38% of all investigations on charities in Britain are done on Muslim charities. Yeah, but nobody questions that. Nobody goes and challenges this, but it's there. So stop and search, as we mentioned earlier, and Dr. Fatima very well elaborated. What are we doing about that? Do we just accept that? Yeah, because we're accepting some sort of management. We tend to then think, there might be something wrong with us. Same thing about prison population. Why are Muslims more in prison? Is it because Muslims are criminally minded? What is there? And people are scared. And so these are the sort of 5 aspects. And these aspects are not simply academic. It's very important because what it does is a community that has been subjugated to racist discrimination or xenophobia itself is divided. Once it's divided on how to approach it, it means that it takes a very long time before they can converge to overcome it. And this division is not, I'm not saying that this is a systemic idea that some people have set around a table to create this. It emerges through the whole structure of Islamophobia itself. So to go back right at the beginning, I mentioned 2 take-home messages. First is we shouldn't reduce Islamophobia to the real and tangible, which is very, very important. But there's a much bigger picture of what Islamophobia constitutes and how it manifests itself, and how we should think about Islamophobia so that we can try and address it. The second aspect of it is how it's impacting upon us as a community, and how we need to also see that in which category each one of us are in one of those categories, or we could even add more categories if we try and think about it, and how that is also impacting in undermining an anti-Islamophobia strategy and trying to redress this issue. Jazakallah khairan. I hope that's a very short introduction to a very big topic.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Ismail. Although it was very short, it was quite a deep introduction actually. And also trying to focus on the variations and connecting Islamophobia to the institutional racism in the UK. And our next speaker is Sheikh Danjuma Bihari. Sheikh Danjuma is more of a community scholar, a historian, and an anthropologist, and he's a well-known public speaker as well. He will be speaking about the Black Muslim experience, I think particularly the experience of Black Muslim converts. It's usually among our Muslim circles, especially among the Asian Muslim circles here. We have a very high level of ignorance on what happens among the Black Muslim community here. Our basic reference is always oscillating between Bilal Anhu and Malcolm X, and nothing more than that. So I hope Sheikh Danjuma Bihari will be able to fill in that gap when he's going to speak, alhamdulillah. So Dr. Danjuma Bihari, welcome. You could unmute yourself to speak. The speaker is off. Okay, yeah.
Can you all hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Assalamu alaikum. Salatu wassalam ala ashraf al-mursalin ajma'in. My subject is really where we, the CCC, the Caribbean Convert Community, interfaces with the wider Black community involved in the Black Lives Matter, and how Islam can play a transformative and contributive role to the entire process. And the reason that I raise this subject and bring it to the attention of the public, it's because there is a sort of internecine problem in the Caribbean community, in the Black community. For some time now, it's been happening. And there are, not as the brother Sheikh Patel just said before, it's not intentional, it's sort of organic, a process by which we're being sidelined, as if Islam does not have that space, the space once occupied by Muhammad Ali, Malcolm X, Rap Brown, Karim, the greats from the 60s who were part and parcel of the whole civil rights anti-Jim Crow process. It seems that there is a sort of a movement within the Black conscious community to say that Islam, far from being a helpful adjunct to the process, Islam is actually a Trojan horse. And it's a Trojan horse wherein ideas are imported into the African and Caribbean community, the convert community, which are inimical to the development of the community. In short, it's a Trojan horse for Arabism. Now, this has come about within the rise, and I don't want to start getting too sectarian too early. That may come up in the question, the Q&A. This has come about during a period when the converts shifted from converting with a view to cleaning up, uplifting, and helping their local communities to one of concentrating more on the length of your beards and toes. There was a conversation that went down a rabbit hole, and it stayed there for a very long time, and it was about how long is your beard and how short is your throat. And for a long time, the African Caribbean community did not seem, the Muslim community did not seem to contribute to the whole idea of this process that's happening now. It has been going on, but we have been sidelined. And my mission here is to explain that we are caught between a number of dynamics. One, as the brother alluded to earlier, Sheikh Patel alluded to earlier, a certain amount of misunderstanding from the heritage communities, and including amongst the Somali, the Moroccan, Bengalis, the Pakistanis, all the what you call heritage or traditional communities. There is a mild sort of tension between the expectations of the convert and the cultural heritage of these communities. Now, I am one of the advocates of culture. I do not believe culture is the C word. I balk immediately when people say the problem with Islam as it's practiced today is there is too much culture and too much religion. I disagree with this. I think as you have good and bad cholesterol, you have good and bad culture. You don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. And I don't expect, and I'm speaking to my African Caribbean brothers here as converts, as much as to the wider traditional community. I don't expect, if there is a symposium organized, that there will be jerk chicken simply because 5% of the Muslims are Caribbean. It simply cannot be that way. And sometimes there are strange expectations of my community that there be more inclusiveness from a particular generation that did not understand inclusion. That generation didn't understand it. It's the old adage, the first generation has the experiences, the second generation tries to distance themselves from the experiences, and the third generation tries to recoup what's lost. The loss of language being one of the fundamental things that sometimes becomes problematic in the generation that's lost this language. And I can speak about this a little coming from Trinidad, where my grandmother was the last person in our family to speak Malayalam. She also spoke Tamil, but that it died with her. And it's later, my generation, my father's generation would be of the opinion, well, no, we live in the West and the way forward is English. But then the third generation, recognizing the loss, tries to discover that loss. So you have that, there's a whole, so the Caribbean community is not a monolith. There's a lot of dynamics. The Jamaican converts are actually different from the Trinidadian converts to a large extent, because the Trinidadian convert community has had a taproot, still growing, an ongoing tradition of Islam ever since the days of slavery that never entirely went away, with the Mandinka society in Trinidad, which was in fact the first, what you might call, repatriationist movement before the Rastafari movement and Marcus Garvey and the UNIA came up with the concept of, Africa for the Africans. The Sheikh Muhammad Yunus Bath, the chief imam of the Mandingo society in Trinidad, actually petitioned Queen Elizabeth so that the African Muslims of Trinidad could purchase their own freedom They did not ask to be set free. They bought their own freedom and said we were prepared to pay for our own birth, our own passage back to Africa, because from Africa it is possible to perform Hajj, the pilgrimage. We can't do it from this place where we live in Trinidad. And so, in a sense, the first Back to Africa movement, the first Black conscious movement in that regard, Muslims were involved in it. Now today what's happened, that's forgotten. And there's a sense that, or perhaps I might even talk about the 1835 jihads in Brazil. That's also partly forgotten. And when the Black liberation struggle is discussed today, Muslims are sidelined. And it's a little bit our fault because, as I said, since the 90s, we began to concentrate on how long is your beard and how short is your thobe. And we hardly invested in the history that's there, that has to be researched. It's not in your face. You've got to go to look for it. And I can discuss these things in the Q&A if you want to ask me. But basically, we spent a lot of time learning very stilted Arabic and very overpronounced ways of doing things that, you know, made people in the Gulf smile. This is where many of our brothers and sisters, brothers mostly, went to study, and they came back being more, to use an ironic analogy, more Catholic than the Pope. So I think we have to look at our dynamic in light of all of these things happening in the Caribbean community, where I believe we need to not be told that Islam isn't a part of the BLM. There is the notion abroad, and I understand it and I hear it. The notion is BLM, and I'm going to say it straight up. I've been asked to speak here, and I'm known not to be backward about coming forward, because the BLM movement incorporates, it's a very wide umbrella and incorporates a lot of movements, and some of them, it is claimed, possess ideals which are at variance with Islam. Muslims believe that Muslims should not be a part of the BLM movement. I personally disagree. We are voters of, many of us vote for the Labour Party, and many of the policies may be at variance, but for the greater good, we work with them. Sheikh Ahmed Kathrada of South Africa, he worked very closely with the ANC and Nelson Mandela in order to end apartheid. And he, in fact, in his day, Ahmed Kathrada was pilloried and vilified for it by certain elements who do not understand that Islam is first and foremost about justice. It's about looking after the oppressed, the orphan. The Prophet was an orphan. He who cannot help defend himself should be defended. And I think perhaps I might have used up my allotted 15 minutes. And if there, I understand that I've gone a bit, I've taken you all around. I was going to actually go as far back as the Crusades to explain what the Sheikh Patel and Sister Fatima spoke about, an almost clash of civilizations. I was going to go back as far as the Crusades, bring it to the Reconquista in Spain, as Spain was lost forever to the Muslims. The Ottomans occupied Eastern Europe, that seesaw, which then pushed the Europeans into the age of discovery. And that's the part of the story where my people come in, for we were taken there as slaves by the Spanish. And one of their laws was that after the Wolof uprising, Wolof are Muslims of Senegal, after the Wolof uprising, Wolof slaves on the island of Hispaniola, which is today Haiti and Dominican Republic, no more Muslims should be allowed into the New World because they're subversive elements, and they set the other slaves to boil. They start revolutions because they had the facility of literacy. They could spread their good propaganda in Arabic language, send notes around saying, okay, it's time to make this town a bit hot. And therefore, the whole idea of the clash of civilizations is actually quite old. It goes back to the Iberian Peninsula, the so-called age of discovery, Columbus, and right up to the modern day. I think I've taken you on a global trot that's a bit exhausting. So I will stop here and thank you all listening for your kind attention, and thank the panel for your wonderful contributions. You're not speaking as though everyone's finished. Sister Fatima and Sheikh Patel, thank you all very much. I learned a lot listening to you both. And now I shall say, Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Okay, Jazakallah, Sheikh Danjum. It was very enlightening that you could actually take us on a globe-trotting and almost back in time. And inshallah, we'd be actually very interested to hear more about that in the Q&A. And again, to all those who have tuned in, this is StriveUK, and we do keep regularly such events under the banner Thafakkur, and we do discuss periodically such topics that are of socio-political importance from an Islamic perspective. Now we start with the Q&A, and there is questions coming in. So I think one of the first question from my part to Sister Fatima, and then later after that to Dr. Ismail Patel and to Sheikh. So to Dr. Fatima, you did speak about, is Dr. Fatima online? Yeah, geez. So you did conclude speaking about institutional racism with focus to policing, actually. So most of the, of late, in the couple of weeks we have seen is that the focus was on policing in the US, with, of course, with the gun laws there, and the brutality of policing in the US is much more visible compared to that of the UK. So with focus on policing in the UK and with the conclusions you made, what do you think as the Muslim community, especially to Muslim organizations here in the UK, how do you think that they should go about with the conclusion that you mentioned? How the Muslim community, what should they take up in regards to recommendations of policing and racism in the UK?
Sorry, can you repeat the last bit, Shaheen? I didn't hear the last part of your question.
Yeah, the last part is that with your focus, when you conclude with your conclusion on policing in the UK and its link to racism, and with Muslim organizations in the UK,
okay,
how do you think they should be taking that up? Because we haven't seen much in that light.
Well, I think one of the problems that I have with conversations around the police in the UK, particularly when there's a comparative element with the US, one of the first things everyone does is compare the fact that police officers in the US carry guns and we don't do so here. Okay, yes, I mean, there's no denying that, but also we've got to remember that that doesn't therefore absolve the violence that our police does perpetrate against Black and brown bodies, including Muslims and non-Muslims. So I think it's important to factor in that just because someone isn't carrying a gun and it's not being filmed for people to see, that somehow there isn't violence happening, because, you know, since 1990 there have been more than 1,700 deaths in police custody here in Britain, and the vast majority of them have been young Black men, and also young Black women, and, you know, Muslims also. So I think it's to me, this comparison just doesn't hold any weight, because we still see the same violence that is enacted and manifested in other ways without the presence of guns or having guns. What should Muslims do? I mean, I think one of the things that is difficult, particularly for the Muslim community, is because Muslims themselves have been co-opted by the state to become the police for the state, the eyes and ears for the state, particularly through the prevent strategy. So I think one of the first things I advocate for is for the complete none sort of alliance, non-cooperation with the police is where I sort of stand, and I would advocate for. Because the police has been at the forefront of the police, as well as, I mean, for example, police presence in schools and police coming into schools talking to young people. I just find it very troubling that we have reached a point where this is seen as the norm, to have this violence being brought into schools and to be exposed to our young people. So I think Muslims, what I would encourage them is just simply withdrawing their support to any form of work with the police, and I think Muslims also need to factor in how much the police plays a role in the everyday violence against Muslims, whether it's police who arrest Muslims under Schedule 7. You know, they can hold them up to 6 hours. They are not entitled to right to silence. They're not allowed to have, you know, anyone present. They have to speak. They have, you know. So one of the projects that I worked on at Cambridge University, looking at police and terrorism, counterterrorism, where we looked at police, and I interviewed majority Muslims, and they just said that, look, police harass us at every point of our lives, whether it's stopping us in our car because there's an issue with our car, and you know, that can escalate. You know, whether it's being stopped and searched while you're walking with your family, you know, or it's at the airport, you're there to pick up your mum, which was a case study from one of my participants, where he went, young black man, went to the pick up his mum who was coming back from Jamaica on Eid day, so he happened to be dressed in a thobe, and he got stopped and searched at arrivals at the airport. Because he was perceived as a threat. So I think, you know, the police's presence in every sphere of our life is something Muslim communities need to pay need to be a bit more diligent, and train our communities to not cooperate and to not work with the police at all. So that's my personal position on this, and I think we need to demand what is happening across the pond of defunding the police and considering abolishing it as a whole institution.
Okay, thank you. Very radical suggestions, actually, Dr. Fatima. Yes, and there's a question to Dr. Ismail, and the question is from Ijaz Ahmed. And his question is that you spoke about 5 categories of responses by Muslim community. What is the ideal response to deal with Islamophobia at an individual level and the community level? So it's more about an action question.
I think what we need to do first and foremost, start from the reverse community level. I think in Britain, we're so far behind that we need to have a concerted effort and political campaign to get the APPG definition accepted. Now, let me put a caveat to that. I'm not saying that we should get the APPG definition accepted because I think that will solve the problem. It won't solve the problem. By accepting a definition, Islamophobia will not go away. But what it will do is to put some normalcy of what is accepted by the society to behave, the parameters in which it can behave. And if it goes outside that, we would have a legal redress. And I think that's very, very important. And the definition as it stands at the moment includes both, as I mentioned right at the beginning, in my talk about physical aspect and non-physical aspect. So the actual problematization of Muslimness would come into the equation. So I think that requires a national campaign. It is a shame, really, that when the APPG definition, just last year, when it was proposed by the APPG and many organizations, Muslim organizations campaigned for it, Muslims did not write a letter to their MPs. There was no uproar in the media. We did not make the noise. I mean, who's going to do it on our behalf? We have to do it. So that's something very concrete, and we can still do that. So we need our society, community to get to know that. We need to talk about the definition. It's a one-liner. We need to memorize that, talk about it, and promote it. So that's something we can do on a practical level. At a personal level, I think we need to educate people and educate ourselves more than outsiders on what the framing of Islamophobia is all about. As I mentioned, it's extremely important. If you ask the majority of Muslims what Islamophobia means to them, they will revert it to the real and the tangible, the physical. They don't see anything else. They don't see the structures that undermine, that discriminate, the xenophobia, the institutional structures, the governance of how Muslims are governed in this country, ideas of multiculturalism, we talked about prevent, all these things that are undermining Muslim rights. Human rights are being violated, and we accept it. We accept to be governed in that way. And we need to challenge all those. And we need to work in coordination with each other. So very practical, try and support the APPG definition, as I mentioned earlier, not because we think it will solve all the problems and Islamophobia will go away, no, but at least it will be a starting point. It will give us some parameters to work with. At individual level, we have to stand up for what we believe in. And something very important here, I think, and we need to explore this. I'm still thinking about this, and this is the idea of respectability. How would we react if a Muslim in Britain was attacked because of a statement they have made, which we feel is within their parameters? So let me give you an example. Take an example from America. I think Linda Sarsour gave a speech in which she mentioned that there needs to be a jihad against Islamophobia, right? Now that word jihad was hijacked by the right wing, and they forgot all about Islamophobia and what she was saying. And it was about bringing violence into America and so forth. I don't want to go to what the right wing did, but what did the Muslims do? The American Muslim community. What the American Muslim community do is then they tried to have respectability over the word and started taking out adverts. And you can have a look at this on buses, on billboards, on talk shows where Muslims would come across and say, well, Islam is peaceful, jihad means jihad of your heart, it's to purify yourself, that's a greater jihad. So you actually losing your terminology, you're not reclaiming your words. Rather than standing up for what she was saying and put it into context, what we do is we acquiesce towards the right-wing element and try and make Islam compatible for what it should be to them. And that's very important. And Muslims, when they're fighting in the sense of trying to get their rights for Muslims, must understand that they need to work from a position of confidence. They should be able to say and reclaim their terminologies and their words and their concepts and ideas, and they should be accepted for that. And it's a long struggle. It's not going to be easy, but that's the way to go forward. If we don't, then we're going to take 2 steps backwards rather than 1 step forward at any one time trying to counter this. So Muslims at an individual level must understand what they believe in, must respect what they believe in, and be able to transmit that and defend other Muslims who are also on the right and trying to defend the greater community. At a community level, there's one example I gave you, the APPG definition, but on a wider scale as well, the Muslims must also be engaged in more campaigns than just Muslim related. And I think this is something, a very big downfall whenever we have demonstrations in London regarding either anti-war, Palestine, racism. When Trump came, majority of the people are non-Muslims. Of course, we live in Britain, we accept that, they expect that. But percentage of Muslims are not reflected in the crowd. So Muslims mustn't become active in every other field of justice. Yeah? And that's something very important for us, so that we create a wider circle of network who will then come to our support when we need it. So as a group, as a Muslim community, activism is extremely important in this day and age, and particularly when we find ourselves at the far end of the spectrum of being discriminated.
Okay, Jazakallah khair, Dr. Ismail. The next question to Sheikh Danjuma Bihari is the sense of anti-Black racism among the Asian Muslim community here. So it is a fact, it is there. And so what can you elaborate upon that, and what is to be done among the Asian Muslim community against anti-Black racism inside the Asian Muslim community?
As I said, the Prophet actually said that racism or Asabiya nationalism will be with his ummah till the day of judgment. They will have it. That does not mean that we have to philosophically resign ourselves to being racist or xenophobic or anti-Black. I think that education on both sides needs to take place. You know, the often quoted verse with Lita'araf. I don't know, the young boy who opened the discussion recited it, that we are put together to get to know each other. And it's a verb that suggests mutuality, lita'arafu. It suggests that it has to come from both sides. Yet the problem really is that the idea, the premium placed on color is already inherent in certain cultures, and it was like this prior to colonialism. And if you talk about the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which in Africa, Ethiopia has been Christian. There were Christians in Ethiopia before there were Christians in Britain. Yet what you do find, a lot of the saints and the iconography of the angels it's meant to be light, the color of light. But invariably, they are shown as almost whiter people, and the devil is dark. And so what I am saying is, a part of it, the idea of anti-Blackness, part of it is colonial, no doubt. But a part of the idea of it antedates the colonial experience. And that will be very hard to eradicate if you have people in, say, Bollywood, championing BLM, and they themselves are using bleaching creams, then you have a problem. I'm not saying that every person in the Black Lives Matter will be a person of utmost consciousness. You know, the term everybody's using, woke. Not everybody is as woke as the other. And I believe every contribution helps. But that is illustrative of what the question asks. If the person talking about Black Lives Matter still goes home to put on bleaching cream, then there's something cognitively dissonant about that. And the whole idea of dark skin in the Asian community, my grandmother was extremely black. I look pale compared to my grandmother, incidentally, who came to Trinidad from South India on the last boat in 1917. So somebody was, I don't know if the question was about language as well. She was the last language speaker. My dad didn't bother to teach us, and it never came down to us. But there was that color consciousness, because my grandfather is very fair. And there is a direct gravitational pull towards marrying up, as it's called, lighter skin. It's there in the Asian community, in the Caribbean community, in the African Caribbean community, the African American community. There's something called I don't have one with me now, I'm in my kitchen, the brown bag paper test, where you entered a room and one of the criteria would be that the bag in your hand should be, you should be lighter than the color of the brown bag in your hand. And we know that's a direct result of slavery. So it's a very hard one. I think education has to bring that about. But education will have it, it's hard because to be the most educated people, the top captains of industry have a problem with saying, all right, I shall now marry somebody black from Kerala, somebody black from Tamil Nadu. They would rather marry somebody from Kashmir. So, and these would be your intelligentsia. It'll come from the topmost, your mothers, your grandmothers, your great aunts. They will insist upon it, and you will bow to the pressure of it. So I think the younger generation will have to, and I'm talking from my own people too, the whole concept of lighty. Apparently this word came about, I was already a fully grown man, so I don't know some of these terms. I'm 60 next year. I don't know some of the terms these children are using, but words like lighty, apparently our Caribbean people prefer to marry lighter skinned Caribbean girls. And I think in the Somali community, it is not dissimilar. You find a person with the thinner nose and the lighter skin, and possibly the softer hair. Maybe the hair that approximates straightness, the nose that is less prognathous, platyrrhine, as mine is, and so forth. Features that are less Africoid are considered the way forward. So I'm not sure how else I can answer that but by education. I also believe this. There is no inherent, there's no aesthetic, no one aesthetic that inheres in the cosmos that all humans have to gravitate to. If Chinese are, if I'm exceeding my time, kindly intervene. If Chinese are using laser operations to make their eyes less slanted, I want a better word, the epicantric fold. I don't like using terminology that's loaded. And if they prefer to buy trousers or have surgical implants to look more Western in terms of posture, if they're doing that, that might be a tiny minority of the Chinese, Korean, or Japanese population. That would be a small number, but yet it exists because of the global imposition of an aesthetic that the Western criterion of beauty is the way forward. But I think people in the Far East, like China, Korea, Japan, for the most part, are not taken in by it. They're not. I think you will always have, as I just mentioned earlier, a minority who will do it. And so I think Caribbean people and African people and Indian people have to learn to become more comfortable in their skins. And perhaps this will come with power. The Chinese, when they weren't powerful, and I'm old enough to remember the jokes at primary school that we had at the expense of Chinese. I remember the movies like, I believe it's either Bonanza or Hai Chaparral, when Hop Sing, the Chinese cook, was a figure of fun. I remember the days when there was a proverb, not a proverb, a saying, you ain't got a Chinaman's chance in hell. And what they were referring to was the 1840s gold rush, when Chinese came to California to work in the gold mines. And instead of using a canary, the Chinese person was the canary in the coal mine. And if the gases were too noxious down there to exploit that mine, you would know, because the person would die. Hence the expression, you ain't got a Chinaman's chance in hell. So nowadays, who remembers these things? They are powerful, and they are comfortable, and they are confident. And I think perhaps and I think that change is beginning to come. And that's why I think Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put Donald Trump there, so that it can be unmasked. The naked racism of the United States is being unmasked, because he will not bother to take the time to pretend. And therefore, I think changes are happening. BLM to me is a part. I'm optimistic. You may be surprised to know that at my age, instead of being cross-grained and sulky, I'm actually quite optimistic about a future that I know that I will not see, but I know that there is an evolution. With all the revolution, there will be, because revolutions will come and go. Some revolutions devour their firstborn and they disappear, they fizzle out. But there is still, as I called it before, that taproot that continues growing. And I think there is a certain amount of sea change. There is a paradigm shift with the BLM movement, which I think we need to exploit. And Asians and Africans, Caribbeans, and all of us need to know more as Muslims about each other's cultures if we are going to actually make any sense, if we are going to capitalize profitably on the BLM movement. I think I've said too much.
Yeah, thank you, Sheikh. The next question is for Fatima, actually, Dr. Fatima. So the question is from Azim, and the question is that in the protests, recent protests, even in the UK, and among the writings, and if you look online, we are observing, or there is an observation of a lot of white support for the BLM movement, for the black, or racism against the black community. And this is what we perceive. So is there a gap in that, the public visibility of a lot of whites championing against racism in support of the black community? Is there a gap in that, and how do we see that?
What do you mean by gap?
Like, is it what we perceive as real, that there is a lot of awareness among the white community, a heightened awareness, an increased awareness of late? So is that a kind of improvement of what we're seeing?
I think the Black Lives Matter movement has, without a doubt, shaken white communities. There's no denying that. But I think, I mean, I'm very happy to see that a lot of these demonstrations are very multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious. I'm very happy to see that, because I think it's absolutely necessary that alliances are built across the board, across the spectrum, because you cannot fight a struggle without alliances, without comrades, you know, who are in the struggle with you. But my concern is that, particularly around the question of white people joining, is a question around sort of what sort of work are you doing beyond that on anti-racism? Because what concerns me sometimes with the way conversations around race are being framed these days, particularly conversations around white privilege, where I find, okay, it can be a starting point for a conversation, but I find that conversation then just makes it about the interpersonal interactions and makes it sort of solely places the responsibility on the individual only. And that racism only manifests itself through this sort of interpersonal interaction, which then erases the fact that actually it's a systemic issue. It's an issue within every sphere of society, whether it's, you know, economic, social, you know, in any other sphere. So I think, yes, it's great that many white people are coming on board. They're supporting the BLM movement. Many Asians also should come forward and support the movement. But I'm optimistic, but I'm also cautious because I want to make sure that the people who are joining, particularly white people, that they're also doing additional work of understanding what anti-racism involves, rather than just maybe reading a bit about white privilege and these are the privileges I have access to in my day-to-day, but also look at it within a sort of holistic picture of how that plays out systemically, because I think that conversation then is one that can make people uncomfortable, because no one wants to look at the bigger picture, because of capitalism makes you think everything is down to the individual, as if you somehow exist outside of all these structures, and then just a casual interaction with a Black or Asian person, you know, means you're no longer racist. And as Angela Davis says, you just have to, your aspiration should be to be an anti-racist rather than just saying I'm not racist.
Okay, Dr. Fatima, there's one more question. I think it's for a clarification, and maybe this from Shahabuddin Khan, and his question to you is that again, getting back to your conclusion of policing, and the question is directly that are you suggesting that we not obey the law or not obey the police?
Sorry, can you say that again?
The question is from Shahabuddin Khan. So he's asking for a clarification.
Okay.
Again, it is back to what you said in your conclusion. That do you mean that when we should speak of defunding or not cooperating with the police, does it mean disobedience to the police or law as well?
I think for that, I would firstly recommend Asim Qureshi's book. The title's just slipped my mind. Do you know which book I'm talking about? Is it called The Virtues of Disobedience?
Disobedience.
So I think, you know, disobedience itself, because I think people end up discussing disobedience almost always in relation to lawful and unlawful. And I think there's room to negotiate that. You know, just non-cooperation with the police doesn't necessarily mean you're being unlawful. You know, so I think we shouldn't look at it from this binary position. But what that means is we need to firstly continue holding the police to account, because the police in Britain, I think the last conviction of a killing of a Black man in Britain was in the late 60s. I think it was 68 or 69, of a Black man who was killed outside of London. That was the last conviction of a police officer who killed someone and murdered a completely innocent man. So I think we need to, you know, come to terms with the fact that this institution has gotten away, and its officers get away with killing men, killing women, and no one holds them accountable. Although there are organizations, and I do want to plug two particular organizations who are doing phenomenal work. So you've got United Friends and Families campaign. Every year in October, they do a rally from Trafalgar Square to outside Downing Street, and they bring together families of Black, Asian, white working class families, and white, Asian, and Black families who come together and talk about their relatives who have who died in police custody. And obviously the police claim, you know, they overdosed or they hung themselves in their cell, but again, no convictions have been made. So I think so UFFC, so United Friends and Families campaign, and the second is the Forefront Project. They're based in Tottenham in North London. They've been doing phenomenal work with the community, and as we know historically, Broadwater Farm Estate in Tottenham has been it was the only estate or only place in Britain where a police officer had been killed. And because of that, there's been a lot of surveillance. There's been a lot of policing of that particular estate, Broadwater Farm Estate. And of course, that was also the estate that came to national attention in 2011, because Mark Duggan, who was killed by police, grew up on this estate. So to answer your question, I just feel like when we just look at the historical trajectory of police encounters with, you know, Black and Asian communities, it's always been one of, you know, them perpetrating violence against the community. So when the community, you know, is participating in uprisings, we've got to understand that violence itself becomes the only means for liberation, you know, and in other ways, we can you know, call for the defunding of the police. It can be done through through what we're seeing in America of just fully just going out onto the streets and using the streets as our battleground. The other ways is also, well, one of them I've already suggested is non-cooperation. And alternative ways is we create our own community spaces of making sure there's youth services available, because we know there are cuts. There have been cuts across boroughs in London. I mean, I'm from Luton. I'm speaking to you all from Luton, where there are barely any youth centres available for young people to come together. So I think a lot of these community issues, sometimes perhaps we also need to step in and not continuously rely on the state, because they keep pulling funding and they're not particularly interested in these cohesive measures for communities to come together. So I think we need to build alliances. We need to work with one another, and wherever possible, avoid the police at all costs.
Okay, thank you, Fatima. The next question is to Dr. Ismail Patel. And the question is from Saeed Patel, is from New York. And the question is again to do with Islamophobia among Indian Muslims. So it is very rampant in India and it's intense, and suggestions to how to go about Islamophobia with the Indian background, Indian scenario specifically for Dr. Ismail.
I think that's a very complicated issue, but we have to take several things into account. First, we need to try and understand why there is a rise of Islamophobia around the globe, and what is the connection between Islamophobia in the West, client states around Middle East, and then in states that are either in alliance with the West or even against the West. So for example, China, which is not in alliance with the West at all, but you see again Islamophobia there. So there's an arc there that we need to try and understand. And it's a complicated issue at the moment. And the way I am thinking is that what has happened is the justification of discrimination against Muslims in Europe, in Eurocentric zone itself, and particularly the war on terror and how Muslims have been framed as a danger to the society, as being an alien, as being the other, as being one that is diluting their national identity and myth, is being transported across the globe. So it's the idea that goes across, and then that idea then is being practiced by different states who are not necessarily aligned to each other. So for example, China, India, Britain, they're not politically aligned that strongly, but they are allowed to practice, or they get away from practicing Islamophobia because they're putting forward a similar narrative. So this global nature of a discourse against Muslims is something that Muslims themselves need to first get hold of and try and counter it. So we require a counter discourse, a global counter discourse to a discourse that is undermining Muslims. So that's the first thing. As I mentioned, it's absolutely a teaser on every aspect that I'm touching on. And we can elaborate quite strongly and heavily and try and create the different zones in the globe and try and understand how Islamophobia is a global phenomenon. Having understood that there is a certain element, a discussion of how Muslim is framed and how a Muslim is seen to be a threat, it allows different groups to be discriminative against Muslims. Therefore, how do you tackle Islamophobia in India? So this is really from a perspective of a Muslim in Britain, because most people listening to this, I don't think are from India, they're outside India. So how, as external diaspora Muslim, as in non-Indian citizens, do we assist Indian Muslims? First and foremost is really, it also goes back to how you help yourself in the country that you're resident in, is to have a narrative of what you stand for and try and expose the elements that are undermining Muslims or degrading them and differentiating them from the mainstream body of politics. And I think that is extremely important. In here, you have different strategies. You can have what's been mentioned earlier, education, but education alone will not solve the problem. In fact, I would say, quote unquote, the most educated people are the most racist. So you have Immanuel Kant and great Western philosophers who sanction slavery and so forth. So education on its own will not work. We have legislative approaches that we talked about, the definition, which goes towards fitting it. Or we have a decolonial thought, in which we decolonially deconstruct the idea of the normative. And there's a little bit of talk about beauty. That would be a very good example to go for. Why do we aspire to what is considered as beautiful that is put to us from a Western-centric optic? That a body has to be white, blonde, blue-eyed to be beautiful. This kind of simple examples are something that we need to really invest in and try and make sure that what is normative is not necessarily white Eurocentric, and it becomes more national. And this is not just physical aspect. We take about all aspects of how human society should live. So what is justice? How the global order should be ruled? Why is it that the United Nations permanent seats are mainly towards the white group? The laws, how they're implemented, the global structure, the IMF, World Health Organization, all these organizations that are creating a norm, the global norm needs to be challenged. It's basically to have plurality of epistemology, to make sure that the global order is in tune with the people it represents. And this is something very wide, and Edward Said and Fanon and all these people touch on it on a different tangent. I would like to expand on that and to say that what we have, a major struggle globally at the moment, is the denial of plurality of epistemology, that different schools of thought are not being allowed to represent themselves. And the violence we see of the Black Lives Movement, in a way, is a representation of the Black people saying, we have a way of doing things, we have a statement, we have an idea, we have concepts, and we want to be part of the team of the global society. And that's what BLM is. At the end of the day, that's what it's coming down to. And Muslims need to understand that we are being sidelined and we're going down that path. And if we are not careful, if we allow this to transpire and trample upon us, and we do not move very quickly, then the tragedy might be that we might have to wait another 300 years, like the BLM movement, before we can actually get respected. And then our youth would have to come to the streets. So it's something very urgent, and it's something not necessarily just for India, but it's the whole global phenomenon of Islamophobia that is now being transmitted from nation to nation. And I touched something here very important as well. Just want to expand on this for a minute, Shaheen, if it's all right.
Yes,
the idea that Islamophobia is not necessarily conducted by non-Muslims. If you think about Islamophobia in Middle East states, it's amazing. If you look at it, Egypt, UAE, Saudi Arabia, there's Islamophobia in these countries as well. Again, you see the idea here is the ideological perspective of a unipolar understanding of the world. Once somebody else introduces another concept, an idea, they don't want that. And therefore you see Muslims being oppressed. So we don't take guarantee. This is something very important, that we don't take guarantee on a Muslim holding a position of authority. And I suppose very good example, which all of us have discussed, the Black Lives Movement, the Black people who are being shot are sometimes being shot by Black policemen. Yeah? So that's very difficult to comprehend and digest, and it's very hurtful. But once you get sucked into the system, when you starting to belong to a certain school of thought, your color also goes beyond that. You might be discriminated within that school of thought, but you consider part of them, and the other schools of thoughts are not part of your society. So Muslims need to become very firm in what they believe in, what their vision is. They should be able to put that forward. They need to understand their history, their presence, and the way their future want to be. And for me, as a British Muslim, I think we have a great task in trying to address Britishness to have an element of Muslim in it. And I think this is the greatest challenge. I think Paul Gilroy talked about the Black people, the Black Afro-Caribbean, and there's a very famous quote. He says, "There ain't no black in the Union Jack." Yeah, think about that. Why isn't, when somebody asks you British, why do you always think of white people? Why is British translated as white? We need to, when somebody speaks about British, we should be able to reflect all the different society and communities that live in Britain today. When we get to that stage, we will have gone somewhere. And this, then again, speaks directly to the global Islamophobia and what's happening to India. When we talk about India, India should simply not reflect to our mindset, to the myth and the idea and the concept as a Hindu state. It should have the Islamic and Muslim element of it and the heritage they have put into it. We have to bring that out, and it's our responsibility and duty. And it's a long haul. Nothing's going to happen overnight, but people need to act and try and invest into this.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ismail. And there is a question actually from Dr. Saeed Mustafa Ali. The question is actually for all three speakers. So I'll start off with Dr. Sheikh Danjuma and then Dr. Fatima and back to Ismail again. Is that the question to all three is that, is there a shared concept of racism between institutional racism, which Fatima described, and Islamophobia racism. Is there a shared concept, or the specific question is how to name racism in relation to global white supremacy? So, Sheikh Danjuma.
Right. That, I think perhaps I've often looked at racism in terms of white supremacy. And then I've often, especially during the time of the Bosnian War, then there was the Kosovo War, and then there was the Chechenian problem. I don't know how many of you are old enough, were adult at the time of the Bosnian War. Then it was followed by the Kosovo problem. And then you realize these are white Muslims. And therefore, how does the concept of white supremacy address these people? And then I came to understand that white supremacy, as Sheikh Patel, Dr. Patel is also saying, you can be black and be a white supremacist as long as you have internalized the Western concept that was propagated ever since the age of discovery by countries on the far west fringe of Europe. Yes, Germany entered later, but park Germany for the moment. It's mostly countries like, as we know the first two, the Iberian Peninsula. The reason we don't look at the Portuguese and the Spanish as possible white supremacists is because they never properly entered an industrial revolution. So basically, they're like the Arabs, they're poor. They were once an imperializing nation, I'm inventing a verb there, but the Arabs themselves never entered. I'm using Arabs because I'm also speaking to my constituency, people who are very wary of Muslims being Arab supremacists. And I have to be talking to them too, because there is a notion abroad that Muslim black people are a Trojan horse, or ought to be an Arabian horse. But we are a Trojan horse, bringing Arabism, and the Arabs from the times of the Umayyads were imperialists. They weren't really khulafa, they weren't caliphs, they were really kings and all that. But I'll put that to the side and talk about white supremacy again, coming back to mostly Western countries, countries such as America, Britain, France, and to a lesser extent, Holland and the Iberian Peninsula. These are the countries that started that capital acquisition based on colonial conquest. Those were the countries that did that. Then you also have other countries that came to the game later, like Germany and Russia. And whilst we can't accuse Russia of having an overseas empire, it could be argued that the Russians had an inland empire. At one stage, the USSR was one-sixth of the Earth's landmass. They control all, and most of that was not white people. And so when I try to understand racism in that sort of in terms of white supremacy, I personally do not include, and that's where a bit of cognitive dissonance comes in, I do not include the Russians. Muslims who live in Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan may beg to differ. But then there is a history where the Turco-Mongolian people did colonize the Slavs. Earlier in history, you have cities like Tatarstan, Kazan, places in the middle of Russia, which are a remnant of when the Mongols went west. The Mongols went west, and therefore you have now the Russians moving east, creating the USSR. But I will put the USSR or Russia today, and I can't easily do it because there's Chechnya and Dagestan and Ingushetia whom they are oppressing. So when I talk about white supremacy, I am with the Chechen, who is white, saying that the Russian is a white supremacist. The Muscovite or from St. Petersburg but in our minds, and I don't know if I'm satisfying Sayyid Mustafa, in our minds, the white supremacists are the big five I mentioned, the big five earlier. When it comes to Eastern Europeans, I would say this, a Bulgarian, because during the time of the Iron Curtain, many Africans, because the world was divided into the communist capitalist spheres, many countries from the so-called third world then got scholarships to go study in places like Romania and Hungary, Bulgaria, and the like, and they received racist abuse in these countries that were meant to be forward-thinking. Now, I perhaps look at that and call it a racialized Humans are racialized. We see difference. And I tend to call that racism with a common R, with a lowercase r. I call that xenophobia. If they don't have the power to adversely affect outcomes in terms of housing, employment, education, life expectancy, healthcare, that kind of racism with a common R, I tend to call xenophobia. Yet, if I were a Sudanese student in the 70s, studying in Moscow, and I had a friend who left because of the racism, studying in Moscow, and comes back telling me the Russians are racist, then I have to say, but in that sense, how does that dovetail with my neat packages of West bad, East good, West white man bad, East white man good, when in fact, the Russians do have the power to discriminate. They did have the power to adversely affect your outcome. And that is where people say, even though you can't call the former Iron Curtain countries part of white supremacy, yet they can enjoy it vicariously. They can become white supremacists. Hungary is doing it now under Viktor Orban. You see it happening there, where even though they may, well, of course, in a sense, Hungary is another exception, because even though they were colonized by the Ottomans, I believe for 150 years, the Hungarians also were part of they were the junior partner in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So there is the nuance is, it's wheels within wheels, and I think I should let the other people have a go now. I think I've gone on a bit too long. Let me stop here.
Okay, so next, Dr. Ismail, and then I'll come to Dr. Fatima. So Dr. Ismail, the same question is again put to you as well. Your perspective on that.
First thing we need to understand, just expand on what we've been discussing, and very, very interesting discussion. First thing to understand about the idea of race and racism. The term itself, race, came around, I think, 17th century. I forget the exact date, I think 1606 or something like that in Spanish dictionary. Before that, there was no concept of race at all. The word racism didn't come into until the early 20th century. It was to do in the 1934, mid-30s. Again, exact date, I forget, mid-30s. And it was to do with what the Germans were doing to the Jewish people. So you see the idea of racism and race are basically European constructs. They come at different time, and now we're trying to use those words to mean something different. So I think we need to be very specific when we're talking about white racism or white supremacists or the idea of racism itself. And as much as the word racism is constructed and given meaning, and it's given different meanings at different times, similarly Islamophobia is a constructed word with its own meaning and aspects. But going back to the central question, how do we understand white supremacies when there's racism across the globe? What white supremacy means is not the superiority of the white skin color. That's very important. Yeah? What white supremacists mean is to maintain a Eurocentric order. And to maintain a Eurocentric order, you don't have to be white-skinned. It is to maintain a certain order of the world, of how it is governed and how the hierarchy should be maintained. To turn that on its head, I think the way to look at it is, if we take Britain as an example, Britain has enjoyed its supremacies as both intellectually, epistemologically, and in governance in the world order, unchallenged up until the beginning of the 20th century. Now what's happening is it's fighting for its place to be reserved there. And the only way it can do that is to form alliances with other like-minded nations. And those like-minded nations not necessarily are white-skinned people, but they are they're trying to maintain a white supremacy. And therefore, the counter movements, either be the Black Lives Movement, or be any resistance movement, either for political gains or decolonial thought, post-colonial ideas, are challenging the supremacies of whiteness. And again, that whiteness, what brings about white fragility, and the fear and the anxiety and the stress to the white against the other. Is the other then is constructed, who can also be the white people, who are we seeing in London with the BLM movement. So we have here a very nuanced idea of what whiteness means and what counter discourse to that whiteness is. So I think we should get away from this idea of whiteness related to skin color, to the phenotype. And it is more to do with ideas and concepts of how the global order should be functioning and be managed. And once we start to get to that level, we will see that we will have more in common sometimes with people of different colors, different faiths, because those who are working on justice, equality, fairness will see to create an alliance around the globe. And they will come across from different parts of groups as well. So going back, that words are created by us, we provide meaning to those words, and we shouldn't read them as literal. And it's very important to understand that whiteness is not necessarily white color. White fragility is not necessarily white people being feared of the other. And I think if we can take that on board, I think we can go somewhere.
And thank you, Dr. Ismail and Dr. Fatima, your perspective on that. Yeah.
Can you just repeat the question again? Because
the question was actually, is there a shared concept of racism, especially when we are speaking about Islamophobia, we're speaking about anti-Black racism inside the community, and also institutional racism?
Okay, so
in relation to white supremacy was a specific question. Yeah.
Okay, so I think for me, racism has just had different masks, different shades, different, manifestations historically. So if we look at, for example, my undergraduate degree was in German and Spanish, and for Spanish, I did a lot of Latin American studies. And when we did Latin American studies and we did sort of literature and we looked at particular countries and their histories and revolutions, and when we go back as far as the arrival of Christopher Columbus in the Americas, or particularly Latin America, a lot of the constructions around who belonged to what category was actually framed around religion. Right? Religion was used as the core signifier to create categories. And then obviously centuries later, we see that categorization changing to, different colors being used to reference people, and those colors had particular attributes that were attached to them. That did include phenotype. It did include particular ideas around, eyes, nose, mouth, all these, historical ideas of who belonged to which group. Some were slightly more ambiguous, some weren't. So I'll give a concrete example. Again, going back to Latin America, if we look at Brazil and Argentina, they went through, in the 19th century, processes, 19th, 20th centuries, they went through processes of whiteization in their countries. And when they went through this process, for example, the Arabs started arriving on their Ottoman passports, the Argentines, for example, were confused, like, okay, well, these guys aren't Anglo-Saxon, they're not Slavic, they're not Nordic. Nordic was the ambition, the sort of goal that Argentina wanted. That was what it was aspiring for, and to create its sort of nation. But obviously when the Arabs arrived on their shores, they just thought, okay, well, they're basically just like the Italians and the Spaniards. So we're going to put them under that same kind of category. It was a little bit confused, but they were ultimately referred to as Turcos. So when you access census from Argentina from that period, the people who arrived with Ottoman passports in Spanish are referred to as Turcos. Now, racially speaking, coming to today's sort of Argentina, the Arab community is seen as white. They're referred to as blancos. Right? So if we want to look at Latin America, and then when we go to North America, obviously these categories are completely different, So for example, Meghan Markle's marriage to Prince Harry, there was a whole conversation about how Meghan Markle is white passing in America, right? Now here in Britain, I don't think she would qualify as a white passing woman, right? But in America, she does. She's a white passing woman. So I think all these conversations around race and racism and locating it, to me, it just varies depending on what context we're speaking about and who gets to, so for example, India, it's usually, Northern Indians who are seen as the ultimate, aspiration, right? So for example, the framings around Kashmir, or for example, when we've looked at previous conflicts in the subcontinent, there's never been this sort of fetishization of women in the way, for example, we saw with Kashmir, for example, recently. And again, because this fetish is related to particular racial, desires and understandings of, that they're the ultimate women we aspire to be with and want to be with. So I think for me, racism overall, yes, we have the ultimate sort of concept around white supremacy. Then we have racism, and racism itself has its own multiple tentacles. And within that, we can locate things like Islamophobia. We can locate things like anti-blackness within that. So for me, it has multiple layers, multiple tentacles that come off of racism. So, and I think that the example you gave of Bosnians is really interesting. I mean, I was a child when the war was happening, but just having read literature around the war, all this sort of shock factor of, but they're white people, but they were still Muslim, right? And I think this is where it's important when we talk about, how race and racism and racialization have changed. And this is where I sort of stand with regards to Islamophobia, is that it is a form of racism. It's a strand of racism because of the racialization and the process that involves, and how that then includes people like, for example, Sikh men. The first person to die after 9/11 was a visible Sikh man. But the person who killed him clearly wasn't, they didn't compute the fact that this is not a Sikh person. So I think for me, having definitions are always messy. So I don't ever try to get into that discussion around definitions. But for me, I just simply try to locate it within its specific socio-cultural, historical journey, and what that means, and how that plays out today. So I hope I've addressed the question.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Fatima. And it's already, we crossed our time limit. And I think if we don't put a time, we'll just keep on going. And this discussion doesn't end soon. There's a lot of details. And I'm sure that even all three of you would have a lot more to say with the time constraints. Keeping in account your expertise and your activism, there'll be a lot, I'm sure, is unsaid. And inshallah, we look for more opportunities in the future as well. And we're looking forward for all three of you. So Dr. Fatima, Dr. Ismail, Sheikh Danjuma, thank you on behalf of Strive for giving your valuable time and also informing and teaching us on certain things. And also there are still a lot of questions coming in actually. There are a lot of questions I haven't had the time to actually take in. So again, thank you to all of you on behalf of StriveUK. So inshallah, we'll be holding such events every month and we'll see you all soon. Alhamdulillah. Jazakallah khair for attending.